Hello there. A very warm welcome to In Time, All Things Become Beautiful Poetry, Planet and Presence, which is part of the exciting Meet the World series. Many thanks to the National Centre for Writing in Norwich in the UK and the National Arts Council of Singapore for making it possible. My name is Linda France, and I have the pleasure of holding this space for a conversation between two poets in whose work I see my own deep ecological concerns reflected: Esther Vincent Xueming and Jemma Borg. By way of introduction, I'm going to begin with some small snapshots of their rich working lives. Esther Vincent Xueming is the editor-in-chief and founder of the Tiger Moth Review, an eco-journal of art and literature based in Singapore. She is the author of two poetry collections, Red Earth from 2021 and Womb Song 2024, and co-editor of Here Was Once the Sea, an anthology of Southeast Asian eco-writing, and Making Kin, eco-feminist essays from Singapore, among other publications. Esther is a 2025 National Centre for Writing Singapore writer-in-residence, where she's working on a personal essay about interspecies kinship and Vipassana meditation, which I've very much enjoyed reading and discussing with her over the past 4 months or so. A literature educator by profession, she is passionate about entanglements in art, science, literature, spirituality, and ecology. Besides teaching and writing, Esther is a Reiki master and forest therapy guide whose practice involves relating to the more than human world in an embodied, heart-centered way. One of the qualities I find striking in Esther's work is the refreshing forthrightness and clarity in her close observation of what moves and changes, the tenderness and care in her immersive, insightful narratives that honor the primacy of the moment, the fleeting, intimate connections life offers if we're open and brave enough to meet them. Gemma Borg's second collection, Wilder, from 2022, was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, a Lowell Prize winner, and included poems that won the RSPB Rialto Nature and Place competition and the inaugural Ginkgo Prize. Her first collection, The Illuminated World, from 2014, won the Fledgling Prize for Best First Collection and was the winner of the New Writing Ventures Award. Gemma's background is in science. She has a doctorate in evolutionary genetics, and she used to work in science publishing. She lives in East Sussex in the High Weald National Landscape, which she was recently commissioned to write a poem about. New and forthcoming work can be found in Plumwood Mountain Journal, the Times Literary Supplement, Poetry Island Review, and Poetry London. Gemma's work, like Esther's, is also fueled by intensely close observation, suffused with an ecological awareness that is both empirical and individual. I admire the deftness of her poems, which are precise, luminous, and resonant, their sonorous rhythms, the expansiveness of her imagination. For me, they have a shape-shifting quality, moving organically between outer and inner worlds, which is something that both poets share: presence and witness as a radical act of transformation. They take me to surprising, illuminating places and model how to write at a time of ecological collapse into the heart of paradox, meeting both love and grief, absence and presence, words, and silence, where time and place become one radiant thing. So these are some of the themes that we're planning to explore in our conversation today. Esther and Jemma are going to start by each reading a poem that I hope shows you something of their distinctiveness as well as what they have in common. My own particular obsession is flowers and the poetry of flowers. So I've asked them to introduce and read these poems of theirs with a botanical focus, both of them passionate in their curiosity about questions that spill far beyond the plants themselves. Esther, could I invite you to begin with your wonderful fern song?
Yes, thank you so much, Linda, for that lovely opening and that generous introduction. So I'll start with reading Fern Song, which is from Womb Song, my book Womb Song. So Fern Song 1. After you left us, I walked into a grove of ancient trees, and there I saw my fern sisters growing in the trees. They were wild and free and untamed by pots or domesticity. I was humbled by their presence and remembered the wild fern by the roadside path, where, on one of our walks, you led us there and stopped to pee beside the fern. I looked into its center and saw a rosette heart cradling new fronds and thought how similar we were, the fern and I, both holding what was dearest close to our hearts. 2. I'm finding it hard to let go. Fern, how do you shed old leaves unremarkably within caverns of branch and trunk or roadside shelter? How do you make peace with wherever home is for you and grow through the grief and sorrow that waterlog your roots? How do you fold and unfurl quietly into that restive space between joy, contentment, and disbelief? How do you disperse your spores by the wind, trusting that in time all things become beautiful? How do you release tentative shoots that burst forth from your belly, rising like a tender love song from the womb of your heart? Teach me, fern, to shed my brown leaves and grow again with little resistance. I am reaching out to touch you, knowing I can never fully know you. So that was Fern Song. And should I say a little bit about the poem?
If you'd like to, Esther, that would be great. I really enjoyed it very much, especially that last line that you left us with that was so kind of haunting, really, affecting in its simplicity, apparent simplicity, uh, full of very embodied rather than intellectual insight.
Mm. Yeah, I have many things to say about the poem, but maybe I'll start from where you brought up. So the last line. Yeah, I think in this poem, it initially started out as an entire poem without the two lyrics. So in its first form, in its first iteration, it was comprised of many quatrains, and just a full poem, and it ended quite differently as well. And upon revision, so I revised it in the editing process, it became three lyrics, but then I was not very satisfied with that. And then this is actually the final product. So this is the final version of the poem. And in the last line, I think in many of my work, I have this desire for kinship, interspecies kinship. So that is one of my, I would say, like preoccupations in terms of my writing. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there is this distance and perhaps this inability to fully comprehend or transcend the boundaries between human and plant. So here you can see that the speaker is trying to connect, right? This idea of touch, this tactile kind of like you mentioned, this embodied knowing and wanting to connect very closely to this plant, to this fern, and wanting to touch the plant, but then also knowing that there can never be a true kind of intimacy in a way, unless I was a fern as well, right? So this idea of distance. Yeah, and I think some other themes, I suppose, that I try to address through this poem would also be this idea of the Taoist concept of wu wei, or non-action or effortless action. Yeah, so this idea of little resistance. So I'm kind of working backwards now if I look at the poem, the second last line here. Yeah, and of course this I mean, for those who don't know, I wrote Womb Song in response to the passing of my dog Ilga, who really taught me what it means to mother and be mothered. So after she passed, I felt that this was the lesson that she taught me, in terms of mothering, because like biologically I am not a mother and I've never wanted to be a mom, and I've always struggled with this notion of motherhood and maternal relationships. I think because of my own relationship with my mom, which was quite fractious growing up as a teenager, and we had many conflicts as well. So I think I find it really hard. Like I struggle personally to reconcile this idea that I would ever be a mother. But I feel that Elga, she really taught me to appreciate this idea of mothering, and also to expand the notion of mothering to encompass interspecies relationships. Yeah, so I think here I'm also relating to the fern in a way that in a way whereby I'm asking the fun, to teach me, how do I not resist, and how do I just allow the learning to unfold? How do I allow myself to heal and grow, just like the fern shedding its old fronds and growing new fronds? So I think these are some of the key ideas. Of course, there are many other ideas, but I don't want to go through all of that. So the idea of like letting go, being at home with grief and sorrow, and yeah, I think also like wellness. I think that's something as well. Maybe Gemma will also have something to say about that. Like I feel that the grief and loss of Ilga also taught me that um grief opens one to like the wellness of the heart, in terms of really allowing yourself to just feel the sorrow and like embrace that wow aspect of grief. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Esther. That's such an important theme that you and Gemma share, and we'll be returning to that later on. We'll come back to that and sift through the layers of it. Um, but over to you now, Gemma, with your marsh thistle.
Yeah, okay. So Marsh Thistle is the first poem in Wilder. So I'll read it first. Marsh Thistle. A gong sounds in the dark temple of the earth, and now upwards the thistle comes. Nothing sweet about this consonance of purple clusters, this spray of green swords. Nothing sweet, but every part of it a soul, rising high above the soft earth between sea and stream in the farm's hinterland. And what soul is it that embellishes the sky with battlements and bristling lances? What part of a human soul is this thistle? The brave and fearful, lonely, frost-hardy, short-lived, adamant, stubborn, broken heart and bold heart, and contradiction of spine, all the wounded and wounding glory of enduring, all the solitude of marrying a place. Our native Holocene thistle, our unpalatable fen meadow head above the crowd thistle, nectar-rich candelabra rampant with bees, our crackle and frost of threats, our September wind-bloomed plume of thistledown, connoisseur of spiny resurrection, it sows its sons and daughters back into taproot in the sinking ground. Alone and fiercely, it breaks the unmown meadow with its deep rooting and thistle intent. This is the thing done and logged among the reeds. This is the foot in water birth of the place present. And then the upwardness begins again. Yeah, so as you said, Linda, this, I think, for me is, it's a poem of close observation. It's what Kathleen Jemma called serious noticing, which is another way of putting it, which I really like. And unusually, actually, for me, it was a poem which I was asked to write. So I came to it in a slightly different way. So lots of research and drawing together of a lot of different sort of threads, both scientific and poetic. But actually, the first thing I did was to look at a photograph of the marsh thistle. How is it different to other thistles that I might, or the idea of thistle that I might have in my head. And I suppose I got really struck by its sense of persistence and vigor. I think those are the things which struck me first. And, I kind of knew at that point I'd be able to write about it. And, the way that the thistle sort of kind of drills down into the ground as it starts. There's sort of a parallel actually with Esther's spiraling fern or the unfurling, that sort of form. So yeah, I suppose what I wanted to do was to get really into this thistly way of being. And, there's not like a thistly language that you can sort of plug into, but, its entire sort of physical manifestation, its form, in a sense, is its language. And that's what I wanted to look at as deeply as I could. And I do use the word soul in the sense of essence of the thistle. And, one of the things I've been doing in recent months is re-looking at the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. And, I feel really interested again in his idea of inscape. So, the isness of something. And he was looking really, really closely and in real detail at nature, at clouds, at the sea, and so on. And he was looking because he was hoping to see his God. He was seeing God in nature. And by this very close observation, trying to see how things work, he was wanting to know what his God was like. And he also talks about not just the inscape, so that sort of essence of something, but also the in stress, which is the energy that life has to grow in a sense. It's a bit like Dylan Thomas's Green Fuse, which I think is what the thistle really embodied for me. It was that sort of driving exuberance of life.
That's really interesting to hear because I definitely, when I read the first time I read Marsh the Soul, I could hear Gerard Manley Hopkins in the rhythms and in the coinings at the end. So that's so interesting. And I think the whole poem definitely exudes thistleness. You've managed that beautifully. But in terms of this kind of wanting to go to the essence of things, it brings us very naturally. I think both of your poems have this kind of very subtle, numinous quality and hovering around the essence of things naturally seems to take you to themes around time and impermanence and loss and shedding that you mentioned earlier, Esther. You used the phrase, Jemma, in one of your poems, even in a lineage of grief, life blooms. So maybe we could spend some time, each of you, talking about this layer of the lineage of grief and life blooming in your writing. I come back to you, Esther.
Yeah. So I think in response to this idea of lineage of grief, I mean, it's really quite an interesting phrase to think about grief as a lineage and almost like inherited. And in preparing my notes, I was also thinking about death, and how like death comes to us all. So in a way, we are all also inheritors of like both life and death. And grief is connected to death, teaching us really difficult lessons about living well, but also dying well on earth, which then relates to this theme of time, right? The passage of time, impermanence in terms of like life as we know it, and also different snippets of life. For example, the fern time is very different from orca time, from human time, from like elephant time, mountain time. Yeah, so these different notions of like um I would say coexisting timelines and moments of life and death and impermanence. And I feel like in terms of letting go, um that's also something that I think both my work, but especially Womb Song, addresses and deals with, only because it is directly related to the death of Ilga. Yeah, but I think in my work, I do find that of course this grief is also like mixed up with love, right? In a way, the grief exists because of love. So the idea of love, I think, is something that's really strong as well. And the making of home, in terms of like what does it mean to be at home on earth. And I do think that it is related to this idea of impermanence, because when we think about home, I think at times maybe some of us might have this idea that it has to be this fixed notion of home. It has to always stay the same. But I see that in my writing, from my personal essays to my poems across Red Earth and Womb Song, there's actually this, and even now when I'm doing my meditation practice, there's this preoccupation with what it means to be at home, what it means to be at home on earth, what it means to be a daughter of the earth, what does it mean to be at home in one's body, whether one is experiencing joy or grief or loss or love. What does it mean to be at home in the heart, for example? So, in terms of really tapping in and tuning into the heart space, and poetry is allowing me to do that, and also to understand the impermanence of, let's say, joy. It is, yes, we feel it fully, and then it is fleeting and it disappears. And similarly, to experience the full extent of, let's say, grief and sorrow, once again, we feel it fully, and then it disappears as well. So this idea of impermanence, the coming and going. And so I think, in terms of like my work, I realized that perhaps it is also about, or it is really about being at peace, meaning that to just be at peace with whatever comes, whether it is something that we may perceive to be more positive or good, or what we perceive to be more negative or bad, for example. Yeah, so I think that, in just looking back at my writing, and even now, in terms of like the personal essay that I'm working on about Vipassana, this idea of what does it mean to be at peace and at home in the heart and to be whole. And yeah, so this idea of belonging as well, right? Like, where do we belong? How do we belong? And how can we collect like the scattered pieces of ourselves and just arrive and be? Yeah. So I feel like that would be um what my work tries to do in relating to this idea of impermanence and letting go.
Thank you. Yeah, and it does seem to naturally arise from, as you say, meeting what's there, meeting reality as it is, an insight that come to you through your meditation practice, and that it's a preoccupation clearly that you share too, Gemma, as a scientist, meeting reality, what is, and if we meet reality, what is. We know that things don't last forever. They come and they go. So if you'd like to say something about that in your work.
I mean, I think, because I was a biologist originally, sort of that sense of time as incredibly long and, how we're such sort of newcomers to the world and for how long life has been going on. And, life is in this permanent cycle. So nothing's permanent. That's the truth of everything. But I think this to come to sort of Esther's idea about what it is to live in the heart. I suppose what it is to live as a person in the world, and this for me, it ties up with grief because one of the strange things I've always found is that it feels like my life is sort of lived on this surface. It's sort of floating on the surface of this huge grief. This is something I found when I was a teenager. And this big sort of reservoir of grief, over the years I've come to think of as not just mine. It's, as do you talk about transpersonal grief. And I really do relate to that. And, and it's interesting. I think the idea of intergenerational grief is gaining traction these days because, we're beginning to understand, say, from a scientific point of view, that there's a mechanism by which stress can be transmitted down the generations. But I think we're also becoming more used to this idea that we might share grief. So in the sense of ecological grief, and that shared sense of perhaps of malaise that, modern life is not as nourishing as we would wish it to be, almost as though, we've domesticated ourselves too and have lost something really essential. And, there's sort of, I do, in my own mind, I always come back to Virginia Woolf, and in her book, A Room of One's Own, she is talking about how the efforts of all women over generations may eventually give rise to a female Shakespeare. But it's just part of this idea, I suppose, that what we do matters and that what we do adds to a wider effort. And, that in a sense is a very hopeful sort of notion. And I think with life, nothing's wasted in life. Everything goes into the sort of big compost out of which everything is constantly being made, constantly dying, returning to, and rising again. And, maybe into that compost, we've got all of our griefs, we've got all our sorrows, we've got all our joys. And as writers, perhaps that's part of our job is to be accessing those things in a kind of timeless fashion, and that we're all feeding our lives back into this sort of reservoir, which is not only ours, it's all of ours.
That feels a very important thing to bear in mind, and it's something that you both touch upon very naturally in your work, where you speak about the impulse to, not just to accept the letting go of others, but to also lean into the letting go of the self, what you call, Gemma, the tyranny of the self, or the burden of the self, that layering that's almost like a kind of defensive armor against that sense of interconnectedness and enmeshment with all things. I'd like to take us forward into a place where I know that you actually met each other on the page and read each other's collections before our meeting here, and that you've questions of your own for each other, with, I think, a request to hear a particular poem. So, Esther, maybe you'd like to begin with Gemma's poem that you chose.
Yep, sure. So Gemma, I really enjoyed reading your poems. I have the book here, Waldo. Yeah, and I was wondering, the line from Ultrasound, motion is life and nothing grows if it cannot move, really like touched me. So I'm just curious, about what it meant for you in the context of the poem and perhaps your life as you wrote it, and also how this line has it remained relevant for you up till today and how?
Mm. Yeah. Well, thank you, Esther. It's really nice when somebody picks out a poem which you feel like it feels like I don't give that poem much attention actually. But it was really important to me when I wrote it. And, precisely for that sort of reason that you're getting to really. So I mean, in terms of how that poem came about, I had a child, but early on I had a lot of different scans and a lot more sort of scans than is normal. And one of the things that really struck me is that, there's this period of time quite early on when that's all we are is a heart. That's it. The embryo becomes just this heart, which is generating all of the energy that's coming into, concentration in this new being. So, you mentioned it in an email to me, like it's a seed which holds the future, which it absolutely is. The whole person's life is coming out of this manifestation and sort of fueled by this heart, which is sort of ticking away. Um, but it's also a seed which holds, I think, the past because what you're seeing is essentially two people's biological history coming together and creating something new and unpredictable. Um, and in a way, I mean, just sort of go back to the thistle, I was thinking it's a bit like seeing the in-stress of the thistle in action in this heart, which is, ticking away. And absolutely the movement really matters. I think both in the sense that that's the point at which life and death rests, is that heart being able to pump. If it stops, the embryo dies. But also then as the embryo develops and it has little limbs and so on, these limbs have to move. It's part of their development. If they don't move, they can't grow properly. And so there's this sort of literal truth to the requirement for movement. But then there's also, absolutely this thing about, I suppose, us needing to resist stagnation and our ability to grow. And I think we'd held off wanting a child for some time because of similar uncertainties about it. So there was this sort of sense of stasis which we were breaking by actually then having taken a decision and move forwards. And you know yeah, nothing's certain in life except change. And we do have to change. We have to risks. We have to allow things to be lost so that new things can be found. And, I actually think it's a sort of almost a measure of health, actually, our ability to be able to change. And in that way, become sort of more connected with life and sort of natural process, really.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gemma, for that. I think it's such a beautiful way of sharing like this idea of change and life. And if I could just share with you and also with Linda, as I was I think like preparing for this session and I would say maybe meditating on those lines from your poem. Are you all familiar with the goddess Kali? She's a Hindu goddess of creation and destruction. So yeah, somehow her message came to me about endings and beginnings, and this idea about how like the old must be released, so that the new can enter. So I thought like, yeah, that's really quite profound. That this specific line from this poem and how it's connected to this idea of endings and beginnings and the goddess Kali. So I thought, yeah, I should share it with you in case it holds any resonance for either of you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I really like that this line, this urgent heart is everything you are. That again, that kind of focus, and it seems to I kept picking it up in many of your other poems, Gemma, that there was this almost that there's a longing to sort of embrace everything, a very strong kind of unifying impulse. Like, so this is life, as you were saying, this is what life is. It's one enormous, complicated, tangled up
Yeah,
thing.
and you mentioned immersion earlier, and for me, that's such an important word, immersion. And I think that's what we're doing. We're wanting to immerse ourselves in life. Um,
Mm,
yeah.
mm. And we're lucky to do it. And we're lucky to hear what other people, each other, what other poets and each other, what we bring back from those adventures, those explorations. Do you want to say anything else, Esther, or shall we move on to flip the story and come to look at your poem?
Yeah, I think I'm good to for Gemma to pose a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, so in Wombsong, Song, you've got sort of like two parts to the book. You've got some individual poems, you've got the sequence of temple vignettes, and then you've got the dream sequences. I'd ideally like to ask you about all of that. But what I would say, one of the things I really enjoyed in your work, I think, as Linda said, is that sort of careful observation and balance and clarity that you have. I mean, it's said that, nothing is perfected until not there's nothing else to add, but there's nothing else to take away. And I really like that as precepts. And I do feel that with your work. It's honed down to its absolute sort of essential form. And yet also so incredibly evocative and all the things about the dogs as well, the dog poems rather, very much, I could hear and see all of that. Um, so I've chosen this vignette, partly because it's a good example of that sort of self-contained precision that I see in your work, but also because um, the last line really struck a note with me. And when you say, "With my hands, I am feeding my own hunger," I think on one hand it's such a sort of perfect gesture, how to feed kindly and how to give truly with grace, and how that then feeds the giver in turn. Um, and it's such a sort of like it's like a little turn in the poem, that last line. It's suddenly sort of surprising and true. Um, and I was also drawn, I guess, to the word hunger because I find that hunger comes up in my work. It's a sort of like a motif, sort of over and over. And I wondered if you could tell me, a little bit about what hunger means for you. So, like for the moss thistle, the hunger is the desire to sort of grow. Um, and for me, hunger sometimes means literally hunger, but sometimes a sort of desire for something more connectedness, more wildness, perhaps. So yeah, I just thought maybe you could talk a little bit about hunger.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for choosing this vignette and also for the question. So just to give a little bit of context, this poem, well, this series, this set of lyrics, were written after I went for a retreat, in December 2022, in the year that Ilga passed. So she passed in March, and yeah, I think I was searching for something. So actually, the loss of Ilga is my first like I would say the loss of a loved one. When my grandfather passed when I was like a teenager, I didn't feel much because I was not really close to him. But for Ilga, I think because she was such an integral family member to me and my husband and her, it's like the three of us. So she was like a daughter to me, and just like her passing and her loss really, yeah, it just hollowed out my womb, I would say. And so I was searching for something. I went for retreats. I just wanted to like I don't know. I was just searching. So I think that's why this theme of hunger appeared. And as I was on retreat, me being me, I would always be really still quite drawn to the animals on the retreat. And there were many temple dogs there, and I did like want to feed them. It's just a natural impulse, if you love animals, you see that they're hungry, you just want to feed them. So I think it was something quite instinctive for me. And of course, when I came back, I was trying to also clarify my thoughts, and I didn't write the poem immediately. I think it probably took some time for everything to just like um, grow and just to take shape. And so as I was writing this, the initial form once again didn't look very, I mean, it looks similar, but the lines were quite different. So in fact, for this specific vignette, I had to revise it quite a bit because my editor also did say that, she felt like it wasn't quite complete. And yeah, so it took some time. And initially, if I could just read the um original last line, and then you will see what I mean. So like in the original draft, the last line actually was the two of us leave sated. And then I felt no, that doesn't reflect, that is not really what this poem is about. So in the second version, I changed it to I know she's not you and that you are gone, but I find comfort in this exchange. And then I felt that was too literal. So yeah, so this poem really took a lot of revision. And so eventually I realized that it was about the hands, and I did write a personal essay entitled Hamsa, also about the hands and the symbolism of the hands in terms of protection or warding off evil or like nurturing and compassion and feeding and love. Yeah, so I realized that this imagery of the hands was important. This idea of feeding the other in order to feed the self. So I think once again it's very like reciprocal. In feeding another, I'm feeding myself. And yeah, so this notion of hunger, thanks for the question again. Hunger. I realized that it recurs again. So later when I read towards the end, my new writing, hunger appears again. Yeah. So I think like it is quite an instinctive, like to me, hunger is a basic instinct for survival, right? If you are alive, you get hungry, you need to eat, whether you're a plant or a human being, for example. And I think like hunger is also an opportunity. I see it as an opportunity to feed another, meaning that if in this case the speaker witnesses another being that is hungry and wants to feed that other being. So this idea of extending kindness and compassion, but also being able to nurture the self. So in feeding another, I'm feeding myself. I'm able to nurture this giving, compassionate heart of mine, in feeding another. So I do feel that, I mean, in the context of the retreat, it's also this emotional and spiritual hunger for something more, this idea to remember, this hunger to remember and connect to Ilga's spirit, for example, through proxies like this temple dog, this hunger for this bond with another being to be able to mother and feed another even after the loss of Ilga. So like love does not die or stop with death. Yeah, so this hunger is like kind of like a continuation of that connection. And of course, like hunger for spiritual nourishment, which is why I went for the retreat. This idea of like searching and questing, to connect more deeply with like I think the divine. And I think this divinity once again is not external, meaning that this divine is actually this divine self within. So connecting to your divinity within. Yeah. I think that's the theme. Yeah.
The hunger is like grief. So grief is, somebody put it to me as, like hunger is love for somebody or love for something that's missing. And that's like a hunger. Grief is love that has to express it in a different way.
Yeah, it's kind of the two sides. Again, it's that wholeness, isn't it, that you were speaking of. You can't really have one without the other, it seems. So I particularly have appreciated, Esther, you talking about the various iterations, the development of your poems, you've shared with us here, and also while we've been um, exchanging emails about this process, and in our conversation, uh, in our mentoring relationship. Um, and so that leads me on to questions I have for both of you, and I would like there to be space for about your process and your practice and questions of technique and form. So I'm aware I came across it fairly recently, this thing that John Burnside said, where he felt that the best poems were composed on the lips, which seems to bring to mind, that Robert Frost quote where he talks about poetry beginning with a lump in the throat. You know, not it's no accident that those are very embodied images, embodied illusions. And so I'd love to hear from both of you about what's important to you in your process, how you proceed through your work. Clearly, with you, Esther, there's that sense of care and patience in these different iterations as you find what you really want to say. So you get to that place that Gemma's mentioned, where it does stand with such clarity and perfection, and there's nothing that's not needed remaining.
Yeah, many of my poems, especially in Womb Song, I organized it such that the second section are the dream poems. And they are in fact drawn from the lucid and vivid dreams that I had when I was working with healing after the loss of Ilga. So I was doing a lot of like Reiki and crystal healing and meditation relating to crystals and Reiki specifically. And that resulted in me having lots of like lucid dreams and vivid dreams. Yeah, and so I would then kind of like keep a dream journal in a way. So when I wake up, when like the details are fresh in my mind, I would jot it down. And of course, I know that the dreams are not poems. So then I would also have to think about how do I present it. So some of my poems, for example, are a few dreams presented in one dream sequence, but perhaps like the key image or the key idea would take precedence. Yeah, or some of it could just be, yeah, really, this is just one specific vivid dream and this is what happened, but I might rearrange the sequence. So I think that at least that's what I did for the dream poems. And I think for the dream poems, I was also very interested in symbols, because in terms of dreams, right, we think about imagery, we think about symbols and metaphors and what they mean or what they signify. So I was very interested in symbolism and symbols and what this says about like the subconscious. Yeah, so that was that. Um, and in terms of the other poems, let's say the poems from the first section, so some of it came right at the end. For example, my very first opening poem on songs in Womb Song, right before the first section, this was actually written after, meaning that I had submitted a manuscript and then we were going through the editorial process, and then the editor was saying, "Oh, could you share some context?" Because like for me, I know the context of Womb Song, right? So it makes sense to begin with Turtle Song. Like I feel that I don't have to explain this to myself, but she was saying as a reader, it would be good to contextualize my relationship with Ilga. So that's why I felt that, okay, yeah, for me, Talekwa was a very important figure. So Talekwa is an orca. And in, I think, 2017, she lost her baby, her calf. And that really hit me. I don't know, I just took it like it was very close to home, to heart. At that point in time, I had just adopted Ilga. But somehow, the loss of Talekwa's calf, like I felt this immense deep grief as well, and perhaps that was me recognizing that one day I would also lose Ilga. So that is what I referenced to in my first opening poem on songs. And I talk about the orca mothers composing songs for their newborns and how every song is different for every single mother and calf. Yeah, so I think like in terms of the process, some of it was definitely there were many revisions, meaning that I would write drafts, I would revise them, I would go back to it and ask myself, is this really what the poem wants to say? Am I doing it justice in a way? Is this what the message should be? So yeah, this idea of patience. My mentor, Bowie Kim Ching, he was my master's supervisor. He mentored me with my first book, Red Earth. And he always stressed this idea of patience, because I can be an impatient person. So he always told me to be patient, to just go back to the work, give it time, put it aside. So that's what I did, with Womb Song. I just, I would write something, I would leave it aside, I would return to it, and then I would say, is this really what the poem wants to say? Yeah, and then just finding the right words for it and just trusting as well. I think also trusting that, yes, this is what needs to be said, and that's yeah, and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Wonderful. That kind of that poise that's achieved between a balance between restraint and exuberance, that it's kind of the holy grail, really, isn't it? How about you, Gemma? How does your process and your practice work?
Um, yeah, I mean, I was kind of interested in that John Burnside quote about poems being composed on the lips, and I sort of do relate to that because um, it ties the writing very much to the breath, but also in my drafting process, I speak the poems out loud all the time. Um, and I quite like to take them out for walks. So when I go and walk the dog or whatever, I can speak these words out, and it's sort of really helpful as an editing process. And because I think one, it's that sort of mouth feel has to be right, and you can sort of hear then when something goes off, loses the thread somewhat. So I know I was sort of thinking that actually I do think of writing really as a sort of act of listening. And I would say that sort of listening as part of a sort of immersion. So it's not just listening, it's looking, it's feeling, it's the whole thing. So it's getting yourself basically into a place of heightened attention. Um, and there's a quote by Ted Hughes, actually. He says that heightened awareness naturally draws language to itself. And by that, he means the kind of language we think of as poetry. So, um, figurative language and music and rhythm and all of those things that actually just that almost that act of attention allows that to sort of naturally take place. And so it's almost like the work of the poet is actually on attention first. So on attention and then language. And, and I think also, poems are composed on the lips, but they're also composed in your ear and in your hearing and in your seeing. And one of the things I was thinking actually, Esther, was that, it's almost like doing meditation, trying to meditate. And when you're writing, so if you can sort of practice so much that your attention can be held, your focus can be held, um, then it's much easier to write. But then the places where you are, so those blips and sort of errors when you're reading out a poem and you think that's not quite right. It's almost like that's where your attention has just slipped. And it's attention has slipped because it does. That's how it works. That's how the mind works. But also, those sorts of blips or errors or where it's just not quite sounding right, I think are also invitations to go deeper. And I always think like poetry is a very, again, I'd be interested what you think, Esther, but I always think poetry is a very sort of vertical, has a vertical direction. It goes, down and it goes up. Prose is sort of like more of a horizontal direction. It's moving within time, but poetry always feels like it's deepening out the moment. And so, the places where things aren't quite right are actually real opportunities to then go really dig deep into the poem. And as you say, get to what the poem wants to say, because, you don't want to sort of set out with your own intention and only follow that. You want to discover things in your writing process. And that sort of surprise and discovery that you have is, it's both what sustains you, I think, as a writer, but also, makes it very interesting for somebody else to read because they also then will experience, that surprise and so on. Yeah, and I write an awful lot of raw material, and I do that in a sort of journaling fashion. And sometimes I do this thing which is called skinny prose, which is like it's prose, but it's kind of like becoming a poem, so it's got sort of margins and things. But so something like that sort of skinny prose, I would think, yeah, that's a first draft for a poem, probably. But all the other sort of materials, journal material, I do sort of go through and I do a lot of excavation. Um, and sometimes I will cut, like I'll take a manageable chunk of text, I'll cut it up into single words and collage it. And the single words is really important because you're cutting up your syntax, you're cutting up the phrases. And sometimes I find that's a really useful process. And then you basically are using your ear to reconstruct something out of that material. And it is a real, I do put noise cancelling headphones on. It's a real listening, sort of meditative, concentrated space. You're almost sort of trying to sculpt the poem out of rock, Um, so yeah, there's lots of different phases, I think, but so I sort of done the excavation and then as time goes on, it becomes more and more sort of vocal, more and more onto the lips. Yeah.
That's so interesting. It's always very exciting to hear how other poets work, how they write their poems. It's a little bit like visiting artists in their studios, where all the paint tubes are around and the preliminary sketches, all the raw materials. I'm very aware that our hour has passed stupidly quickly. I think we must have been enjoying ourselves. Uh, Perhaps there might be time, hopefully, there might be time just it seems fitting to close with a poem, and I'd particularly like to hear a poem from each of you, a piece from each of you that's about your work now. That seems like a kind of perfect way to bring our conversation to an end. So we might spill over the hour slightly, but I think that's absolutely fine. So, if that's okay with you, if we could start with you, Gemma, and then hear something from you, Esther.
Yeah, I did want to, if it's okay, could I say a couple of things just about this, about the new work? Because, yeah, I think, so a lot of the new work is about my husband who was diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer at the end of 21, and he had 1 year to live. And it was something, horrific, terrifying, and something we couldn't do anything about except face it every single day. And for us, denial was not an option. And, our job in that last year, among all the practical details, was to let go of us, of each other, and also a sense of control. And I wanted to say, it's a really creative place, strangely enough, to be, because you do slow down to that complete present moment. Um, and, you know, it's a strangely alive place to be. And I think we both felt that there were moments of beauty as well as despair. And what I think I really want to do in the new work is to think about denial, because one of the things I think when I first came to poetry was that I felt it was part of the message of getting out the facts or adding imagination to the scientific facts of climate change and environmental degradation and so on. But actually, what I've become more interested in is what stops us being able to change. What is it that is stopping us? And obviously, there are lots of powerful vested interests which are actively blocking change. But what, as us as individuals, why do we have a psychological resistance to change, and why do we sometimes want to deny something when it's very difficult? And I think if anything can come out of what I've experienced, it is that sense of denial is not an option. Um, so yeah, so into that context, I'm going to read one of the poems which was written about a month before my husband died. The light is almost gone, my love. Though you say, I'm fine, there's plenty of time, the light is almost gone, my love. Dusk swells like smoke, diesel fumes caught in its cold. And though I feel it should be raining, it's not. The smothering snow is one word, just one white word, through which we take our last walk. You've been opening the drawers in your mind all day looking for a name, or an object to hold a name. And now you roll restlessness on your tongue like a newborn. When we pause under a street light, our mouths bleeding with fog, I see the elision of snow with snow. our footprints filling in like the wordless fields, your slow feet rooting without echo. It's late, I say. Let's go home. But you're not ready yet. Time is being gathered in like a harvest, snow ripening through darkness to a low hum. You said last year you were happy to be dying with me. My love, oh my love, here we are at last. Everything is snow.
Thank you so much, Jemma.
Mm.
Esther.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Okay. Yeah, so I'll read mine. Yeah, but I think I wanted to say, Gemma, that's such a beautiful poem. Thank you so much for reading that. Yep. So for my to end off, this is actually one of it opens my personal essay, which is entitled Fledgling. So this is the work that I've been working on with feedback from Linda and input from Linda. It is written in response to my Vipassana meditation and also like trying to gather the teachings and learnings that I received on the retreat, which I attended in June this year. And also part of the writing residency work. So I fledgling alludes to the peregrine falcons that gave birth to little chicks and they fledged. Yeah. So I'm also writing about like change and new beginnings, I guess. Okay. So the snail, the spider, and the full moon, days 10 and 9. It is 4 a.m. in Bangli, Bali, and the moon is full and round against an onyx sky. The coldness of the tropical morning still surprises my fingers and toes. I stand tall, a devotee, eyes closed, praying to the moon. Full moon, you orbit my seas and rivers, pushing and pulling at tides. You come to me now, on the 9th day of retreat, silently speaking in lunar light. Tomorrow, a tiny snail will leave a slimy trail along a wild yam leaf, and a spider will remind me of hunger. Yes, my soul is hungry and longing to be fed with the teachings of Vipassana. But the snail, in its translucent wisdom, tells me to take my time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Esther. So, so it feels like it's far too soon that our time together's come to an end. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I'd like to say a heartfelt thank you to both you, Esther and Gemma, for your beautiful work, your warmth and your generosity in sharing it. I'm left with this sense that my own practice will be refreshed by our cross-pollination of ideas, and I hope that yours will too. Gratitude once again to the National Arts Council of Singapore and National Centre for Writing in Norwich for their vision and support. And thank you to those who've joined us here. I hope you found our thoughts helpful and inspiring. Go well.